A question lingers in the quiet corridors of American power. What is the price of a single honest act? Not the price for a president, or a journalist, or a senator, but for an ordinary man. A man paid just $80 a week to walk the halls of history. He wasn't trying to topple a government. He wasn't looking for fame. He was just looking at a door. And on that door, a single piece of adhesive tape, placed horizontally over the lock's latch bolt. A small thing, an insignificant thing, something to be brushed aside. But he couldn't. He stopped. In that silent, empty parking garage, in the deep hours of a Washington, D.C. night, he made a choice. And with that choice, he set a fire that would consume the most powerful office on earth. He had no idea then that it would also consume him. Before he was a footnote in a textbook, Frankwills was just a man trying to find his place. He was born in Savannah, Georgia, in 1948. He never knew his father. He was raised by his mother, a single woman who worked tirelessly to give him a foundation in a world that offered few guarantees. He was quiet, observant. He dropped out of high school, but earned his equivalency diploma while training for a trade. He learned to operate heavy machinery, the kind of hard, honest work that built the country. He moved north, seeking opportunity, and found it for a time on the factory floors of Detroit, working for Ford. But the assembly line wasn't for him. By the early 1970s, at the age of 24, he found himself in Washington, D.C. Not in the halls of Congress or the chambers of the Supreme Court, but in the places that serviced them. He was a private security guard, a man in a simple uniform tasked with watching over the property of others. The pay was abysmal, $80 a week, just over $2 an hour. It wasn't a career, it was a holding pattern, a way to pay the rent while figuring out what came next. His post was the Watergate complex, a sprawling, modern monument of glass and concrete on the banks of the Potomac. It was more than just a luxury hotel and residential building. It was a nexus of power. It housed the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Senators lived there. Cabinet officials kept apartments there. It was a place where history was being made, though Wills's job was simply to make sure nothing went missing while it happened. His life was a routine of quiet patrols, walking the silent, carpeted hallways, checking doors, riding the elevators through the hushed building. The hours were long. The work was monotonous. Frankwills was, by all accounts, an invisible man performing an invisible job. He was a good employee, not because he was ambitious, but because he was meticulous. He noticed things. And in his world of rote repetition, anything out of the ordinary stood out. On the night of June 17, 1972, Frankwills was working the midnight to 7 a.m. shift, a shift he'd swapped for because he wanted more hours, more pay. Around 1:47 in the morning, he was doing his rounds in the underground parking garage, B level. He checked the door that led from the garage into the stairwell, and he saw it, the piece of tape, placed carefully over the lock to keep it from engaging. His first thought was simple, rational. A maintenance worker had probably forgotten to remove it after working in the building. It happened. Wills shrugged it off. He peeled the tape from the lock, stuck it on his hand so he wouldn't litter, and continued his patrol. Just a small irregularity, now corrected. He had done his job. He moved on. He checked other doors, other floors. But something about it, a tiny splinter of doubt, stuck with him. So he circled back. 30 minutes later, he returned to the same door on the B level of the parking garage. Just to be sure. He was a thorough man, if nothing else. He approached the lock, expecting to find it clear. But it wasn't. There it was, again. A fresh piece of tape, placed in the exact same spot. In that moment, everything changed. This was not a mistake. This was not an accident. The first piece of tape could have been forgetfulness. The second was a clear signal. Someone was deliberately circumventing the building's security. Someone wanted this door to remain unlocked. And they were inside, right now. Frank Wills was alone. He was 24 years old, making just enough money to scrape by. He had no weapon, only a walkie-talkie. Every instinct of self-preservation, of avoiding trouble, of simply wanting an easy shift, told him to ignore it, to walk away, to let someone on the day shift deal with it. Who would know? But he didn't. He walked away from the door, crossed the lobby of the building, and picked up a telephone. He dialed the non-emergency number for the DC Metropolitan Police. He spoke calmly. He said he was a security guard at the Watergate. He said there was something strange going on. He didn't know that he wasn't just reporting a potential break-in. He was making the single most consequential phone call of the 20th century. Within minutes, an unmarked police car with 3 plainclothes officers arrived. Wills met them, explained what he'd found. He used his key to let them into the stairwell. They moved up, floor by floor, in the dark. Frank Wills waited downstairs, his part seemingly over. Then the discovery. On the 6th floor, in the offices of the Democratic National Committee, the officers found them. 5 men wearing business suits and rubber surgical gloves. They were equipped with cameras, lock-picking tools, and thousands of dollars in sequentially numbered $100 bills. They were not common burglars. Wills didn't know who they were. He didn't know that one of them, James McCord, was the security coordinator for the committee to re-elect the president. He didn't know that this clumsy, third-rate burglary was part of a massive, illegal campaign of political espionage and sabotage directed from the highest levels of the United States government. He only knew that his small, nagging suspicion had been right. For a few days, it was just a strange local crime story. But then, 2 young reporters from the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, started digging. They connected the burglars to the White House, and the story began to unravel. And Frank Wills, the anonymous night watchman, was suddenly at the center of it all. He became an overnight sensation. He was the Watergate watchman, the humble, honest hero who simply by doing his job had tripped up a vast criminal conspiracy. The press clamored for interviews. He was given a plaque by the Democratic Party. He received a humanitarian award from the NAACP. He was lauded as a symbol of integrity. It was a dizzying, intoxicating experience. For the first time in his life, Frank Wills was not invisible. People recognized him on the street. They wanted to shake his hand. They told him he was a great American. He had gone from earning $80 a week to being a national icon. He felt proud. He also felt that his historic role merited more than what he had. He quit his job at the Watergate, citing a refusal to give him a raise from $80 to $82.50 a week. It seemed insulting. He was Frank Wills, the Watergate hero. Surely a better life was waiting for him. And for a moment, it seemed like it might be. In 1976, Alan J. Pakula's iconic film, All the President's Men, was released. It cemented the legend of Woodward and Bernstein. And in a moment of cinematic verisimilitude, the film cast the real Frank Wills to play himself. It was a small part, a cameo really. He is seen walking through the garage, discovering the tape, making the call. He had a few lines for which he was paid a modest fee. This was the absolute peak. This was the moment his fame and his future seemed brightest. He had been a key player in a story that had toppled a president, Richard Nixon, who had resigned in disgrace 2 years earlier. He was now, quite literally, part of Hollywood history. This is the point where the story should have ended. The humble man rewarded for his honesty, living a comfortable life off the legacy of his good deed. But the file doesn't close there, because this is where the real tragedy begins. This is where America's hero discovered a terrible truth. Fame is not respect, and notoriety is not a career. Frank Wills learned that being the Watergate security guard was not an asset. It was a brand, and it was a brand he couldn't escape. He tried to find other work, but employers were hesitant. Some thought he would be a distraction. Others, quietly, may have seen him as a troublemaker, a man who brought down the powerful. Why invite that kind of energy into your business? Most damaging of all, perhaps, was the perception that he was already rich. The public assumed he had been rewarded handsomely, that the journalists, the politicians, the party he had inadvertently saved had taken care of him. They hadn't. He couldn't get a job as a security guard, the one thing he knew how to do. The irony was suffocating. He tried other things. He worked for a time with the comedian and activist Dick Gregory, but it didn't last. He tried to start a business. It failed. He drifted. The man who was once celebrated as the epitome of civic duty found himself bouncing between low-wage jobs, struggling to make ends meet. He was a celebrity with an empty wallet, a historical figure who couldn't pay his bills. The interviews dried up. The public's attention moved on. Watergate was over. The powerful men who went to prison eventually got out, wrote their memoirs, and found lucrative second acts on the lecture circuit. The journalists who broke the story became Pulitzer Prize-winning legends, commanding enormous salaries and prestige. The political system, wounded but intact, ground on. And Frank Wills? Frank Wills was left behind. The machinery of history had used him, celebrated him, and then completely, utterly discarded him. The pressure mounted. He wrestled with his legacy. Was he a hero, or was he a fool for thinking his one act of honesty entitled him to anything more than a thank you? He was caught in a trap. Too famous to be an anonymous worker, but not famous enough to be wealthy. There wasn't one single dramatic moment of climax for Frank Wills. His confrontation wasn't with a person, it was with a system, with an idea. The climax was a slow, creeping, soul-crushing realization. It came in countless quiet moments. The hopeful job interview that ended with an awkward, "Oh, you're that Frank Wills." The landlord asking for the late rent, unable to believe a man from the history books could be broke. The flicker of recognition in a stranger's eyes, quickly followed by a look of pity. The peak of his struggle was the moment he truly understood that his great historical act had not elevated him, but had permanently trapped him in the amber of a single night in 1972. He would never be just Frank Wills again. He was Frank Wills, the Watergate guard. And that title, which had once felt like a badge of honor, now felt like a life sentence. A sentence to a life of poverty and baffled obscurity. He had performed his duty perfectly, and his reward was to watch everyone else involved in the scandal, from the criminals to the crusaders, get rich. He got a bit part in a movie and a lifetime of being a trivia question. The American dream, in his case, had turned out to be a cruel and bewildering joke. The final act of Frank Wills's life was not lived in Washington, D.C., under the bright lights of history. It was lived in the shadows. He eventually gave up. He left the capital city that had made him famous and then forgotten him. He returned south to be with the one person who had always been his anchor, his mother. He moved into her home in North Augusta, South Carolina. He was no longer a symbol. He was just a son, caring for his ailing mother until her death. After she passed, he stayed in the house, living a reclusive life. He survived mostly on her Social Security payments and what little he could scrape together from odd jobs. The hero who helped save American democracy was, for a time, living on less than $200 a month. The world had moved on so completely that when he was arrested in 1983 for shoplifting a pair of sneakers from a store in Augusta, it barely made the news. The charge was for a $10 item. The man who had exposed a conspiracy worth millions was now a common criminal over a pair of shoes. He pleaded guilty. He was given a suspended sentence. For the last years of his life, he was largely alone. He tended a garden. He kept to himself. The neighbors knew who he was, this quiet man, haunted by a past he couldn't outrun. He was, in a sense, a ghost of history, living out his days in quiet anonymity. In the year 2000, Frank Wills died. He was found in his home, having passed away from an undiagnosed, inoperable brain tumor. He was 52 years old. He died penniless. His body went unclaimed at the morgue for a time. There was no state funeral, no national day of mourning. His grave in a South Carolina cemetery is marked by a simple headstone, paid for by donations. It is inscribed with the words, "The Watergate Security Guard. Deeds, not words." The legacy of Frank Wills is a deeply uncomfortable one. It is a stark reminder that history is not a fairy tale. In our national narratives, we crave stories of simple virtues being rewarded, of the little guy winning. But the story of Frank Wills is a damning indictment of that myth. He did everything right. At the pivotal moment, faced with a simple choice, to ignore something or to report it, he chose to act. He followed his training. He demonstrated integrity. He trusted the system. And the system, in turn, chewed him up and spat him out. His life is the great unspoken tragedy of the Watergate scandal. It asks a disturbing question. What do we owe the people who, by chance or by character, uphold the foundations of our society? Frank Wills's story suggests the answer is nothing. Nothing at all. He is the ghost at the feast of Watergate, a testament to the fact that while history remembers the powerful and the privileged, it often has a brutal, selective amnesia for the ordinary men who set it in motion. His contribution was not a grand strategy or a political masterstroke. It was the simple, dutiful act of a man noticing a piece of tape on a door. But in that small detail, a republic was tested, and a truth was revealed. The truth that the greatest acts of civic courage are often the quietest, and that their consequences can be the most profound and the most tragically unjust. This file is now closed, but the archives are vast. To be the first to know when the next dossier is opened, subscribe to Federal Confidential and turn on notifications. In the comments below, let us know which secret story needs to be told next.